Welcome to the Calm Analytics channel. I'm Boris Tizengauzen. Today is November 17th, and we have a very eventful episode ahead. So, in this episode, we've found an explanation for why Russians defend Putin at any cost, even when propaganda myths are falling apart right before their eyes. And this explanation was found during an experiment with doomsday cults, strangely enough. The Russian Orthodox Church has asked its priests to watch their language, and Kremlin assets remain untouchable. A new defender of Putin's gold in Europe has emerged, and Trump has supported new sanctions against the Russian Federation. A pension life hack from Putin: you don't have to pay pensions if people don't live to receive them. And 4 countries to choose from. Maduro has been offered options for escape. Where will the Venezuelan dictator run, and how will Donald Trump deal with him next? This and more in today's episode. There's going to be a lot of interesting stuff. If you're new to the channel, welcome. Subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And here's an interesting point. Over the weekend, I was discussing with some acquaintances why suddenly a large number of people who read books, have access to the internet, are educated. Why do they believe in the most straightforward, wild, and aggressive propaganda? You know, I have acquaintances, or rather I had them since I stopped communicating with them. You can talk to them, for example, about movies, and they get it, they understand. You can talk about literature too, but as soon as the conversation turns to Putin or Russian aggression, it's like they become completely different people. I think each of you has acquaintances like that. What's the phenomenon here? Why can these people discuss some topics, but when it comes to others, it's like a visor drops over their eyes? About biolabs, about combat mosquitoes that are supposedly going to infect only Russians. They believe all of this. So on the one hand, this person can discuss some economic or scientific topic, but on the other hand, believes that Ukraine wanted to attack Russia, a nuclear state, that everything is going according to plan for Russia, even though after the full-scale invasion, Russia has been bogged down for the 4th year. A year and a half. Pokrovsky says that everything is going according to plan, that it was all intended this way, that the sanctions are actually beneficial for Russia. They believe this. But is Russian propaganda the only reason they behave this way? Well, that's not the point here. Why do they keep believing? There's a wonderful experiment on this topic by one of the fathers of American psychology, Leon Festinger, about cognitive dissonance. Many of you have probably heard about it. But what's even more interesting is how the author himself came up with this concept. Now, using the example of a doomsday cult, I'll show you why most Russians continue to believe in complete nonsense. So, a fascinating experiment took place in the context of 1950s America, with the fear of nuclear war and the rise of apocalyptic cults in the US. And so, Leon Festinger learns about a cult called the Seekers. They were expecting the end of the world on December 21st, 1954. The leader was Dorothy Martin, also known as Sister Thedra, and she claimed that she was receiving messages from the guardians on the planet Clarion. That Jesus was already there on the planet Clarion, and so the end of the world was coming, and Jesus would take everyone, not even Jesus himself actually. Everyone would be taken by a UFO and brought to Jesus. In other words, the United States would be destroyed by a catastrophe, and the true believers would be transported there by UFOs. Well, the sect included several dozen people. There were engineers, there were students, there were all kinds of people. That is, many quit their jobs, sold their possessions, all just for the sake of salvation. That's how much they believed in it. And this father, a psychologist, one of the founders of American psychology, infiltrates this sect together with his colleagues, posing as new converts. They document everything, record all the conversations, and then the X day arrives, the day of the end of the world, December 21st, 1954. Everyone is waiting, but the catastrophe doesn't happen. The UFO doesn't arrive. So what happened next? You probably think that everyone just stood up and said, well, that's it, let's go home. What kind of nonsense is this, Sister Thedra? This isn't what we agreed on. At 4:45, Sister Thedra receives a new message from the planet Clarion, saying that the faith of this sect has saved the world. Do you know how the group reacted? Only a few people left. Only those who had made minimal investments. those who didn't quit their jobs, didn't leave their families, didn't sell their houses or property and so on, those were the ones who left. They said, what is this anyway? A new message arrived. That's it. The end of the world is cancelled. But the group, those who were the core, who had sacrificed a lot, some had given up everything, became even more convinced. Do you understand? And that's when the group, as a collective, started actively proselytizing to others. And that's when Festinger, after careful observation, concluded that when facts directly contradict deeply held beliefs, this psychological phenomenon known as cognitive dissonance arises. To resolve this internal conflict, people don't abandon their beliefs. They reinterpret this reality. You see, they find explanations for why Russia has been here for 4 years, why certain mosquitoes are supposed to only kill Russians and so on, and infect them. In other words, they adjust their world to fit this reality. And for Russians, well, it's clear that propaganda also plays its part. So, Russians have spent their whole lives, Putin has ruled for a quarter of a century, devoting themselves to justifying why things are the way they are. Now, I'm not talking about all Russians. There are Russians who are fighting for Ukraine and helping Ukraine. But for many, it was easier to justify, to not protest, to accept this narrative than to break their entire reality. It's just simpler to accept it, and then everything falls into place. There's always an explanation for why the so-called second or even first army in the world can't manage to defeat Ukraine, let alone win. Right now, Putin is simply begging, just give me a piece of land. Do you understand? There are plenty of similar cases in history. The Great Disappointment, for example, that was in 1844. Jim Jones's cult, that's Guyana, 1978. That's actually very close to what Putin is doing. That is, when the leader had clearly already lost his mind, many followers kept believing in complete and utter nonsense, because they had invested everything into that cult. And many Russians have invested their lives into the cult of Putin. You see? They can't open their eyes. That's why there was such a crisis for those who spent half their lives in the Soviet Union and the other half living outside of it. In other words, it's a refusal to acknowledge that there was a totalitarian regime, millions repressed, executions, and so on. But on the other hand, the ice cream in the Soviet Union was so delicious, wasn't it? That's exactly it. The brain keeps searching. Now that's a good fact. But not everything was like that there. Why didn't I want to admit it? The same thing is happening here. And by the way, with Jim Jones's cult, it ended in mass suicide. 900 people. And Russians can't admit it. They don't want to see Putin's mistakes. On the contrary, they strengthen their faith. They reinterpret reality. Because admitting the truth would be very, very painful. You'd have to break a lot inside yourself. By the way, friends, in our last program, we finished raising funds for the second ventilator for the first medbat. A huge thank you from the first medbat. There will soon be a video from them, very life-affirming. You are just amazing. And since we already have several fundraisers, one after another, we're starting a new one. This fundraiser is for night UAVs, Mavics plus Avengers, for the 32nd Steel Brigade, which is fighting in the Pokrovsky direction. That's where Putin has supposedly already defeated everyone, conquered everything. Millions of people have supposedly surrendered to him. He's already encircled everyone, and so on. Well, that's exactly where the 32nd Steel Brigade is giving him a hard time, among others. And here's a message from the commander of the battery of the 32nd Separate Mechanized Steel Brigade. And the commander there, I want to tell you, is no ordinary person. This is a message addressed to us. Please take a look at it.
Бажаємо здоров'я! Я командир батареї американських систем М109 Паладин 32-ї окремої механізованої сталевої бригади, яка зараз знаходиться на Покровському напрямку. Ми разом із глядачами каналу Бориса Тізенгаузена збираємо на комплекси Mavic 3T та Mavic 3 Pro та антени з репітерами до них. Ми дуже дякуємо глядачам каналу, які допомагають нам та не забувають, що війна триває. Дякуємо вам. Слава Україні!
Героям слава!
This is the kind of commander they have in the 32nd Steel Brigade. Friends, let's help our artillerymen. The link to donate is in the description of this video. There are options for Mono, Private, and PayPal for those who want to help from abroad. To everyone, every time I say a huge thank you. If for some reason you don't see the payment details or you're watching on another channel, here's a QR code. It also leads to the donation page. And do you remember that incredible story from the medical battalion, the one for whom we provided a ventilator? Do you remember that incredible story about the evacuation of the soldier who spent more than 30 days wounded at the front and then was evacuated by the mall ground ambulance, the one we raised funds for together? Back then, many people wrote that it brought tears to their eyes. This unmanned vehicle traveled 60 kilometers, enemy drones dropped all sorts of nasty things on it. But despite a damaged wheel, it made it through, the soldier was picked up, and now he is recovering. And so, for all 30 days, the sergeant stayed with him at the position, never leaving his side, waited for the tow truck, and loaded the wounded soldier onto it. He himself stayed behind at the position, and back then many people asked what happened to that sergeant. Well, a couple of days ago he made it out, and when I got the message, honestly I almost jumped up to the ceiling. So he made it out a couple of days ago, and now we can finally talk about it. It's just incredible. I believe that these are people made of titanium. People like this deserve awards, and by the way, we will do everything we can to make sure that happens. Well done, Sergeant. Soon, I hope, we'll learn his name and thank him personally. Friends, it just so happens that our program is about both bright people and dark non-humans, about those who make no less of a contribution to brainwashing Russians, about the Russian Orthodox Church. The Russian Orthodox Church has accused Russians of attacking the Church because of the publication of scandalous statements by priests. I quote, "The publication of scandalous statements by priests on the internet is of a planned nature," stated the chairman of the Synodal Department of the Moscow Patriarchate for Church Relations with Society and the Media. He continues, "People have caught some kind of wave, some trend, and decided, let's regularly watch sermons and look for something like that." Seriously? Looking for something? Maybe you just shouldn't say things like that, then no one will find anything. According to him, this kind of thing happened before as well, but now it is simply of a planned nature. Or maybe it's because these priests have to justify the war as well. There's so much stuff coming up there. This filth has appeared. They've gotten involved in political matters. Well, actually, the Russian Orthodox Church has never been separated from the FSB. I think Patriarch Kirill has at least the rank of a general. An FSB rank. In this regard, this person responsible for relations with the media urged clergy not to expose themselves and not to say too much. A preacher should understand that when half the congregation is filming him, there's no telling where that footage might end up. So it turns out that in our program, where almost every episode features some kind of nonsense from representatives of the Russian Orthodox Church, the ones to blame are not those who say and spread this nonsense, but rather it's those who record them, apparently. That's the logic. And then, for example, let's just list some of the latest things representatives of the Russian Orthodox Church have said, just what I remember, like someone recently claimed during a sermon that Russians are not allowed to laugh. That's not for Russians. That life, in fact, is meant for suffering, not for joy. Or take, for example, Father Kirill. Markovsky stated that for a woman, 10,000 rubles is enough for a normal life, and that a salary of 100,000 is a terrible trial for a woman, an ungodly luxury, and that 90,000 out of those 100,000 should be given to the needs of the church. And yet another archpriest recently made a statement that a woman should be a domestic fairy, and that work interferes with her true purpose, to cook, borscht, sit in the kitchen, and so on. And as for the calls by the head of the Russian Orthodox Church, Patriarch Kirill, to pray for Putin, and how he called the war against Ukraine a holy war and promised forgiveness of sins to all Russians who go, sign a contract, and die in this war against Ukraine. He promised forgiveness of sins. How can one truly contemplate, perhaps even deeply so, about this spawn of hell, if I may say so? Here's another interesting piece of news. The head of the largest depository of Russia's frozen assets has threatened to file a lawsuit against the European Union if those assets are confiscated. The international depository Euroclear in Belgium may go to court if the EU decides to seize these frozen Russian assets. This was stated by the organization's CEO, Valérie Aubin. That's not out of the question. There are laws, and depending on the legal framework, we will decide what we can and want to do. Currently, 193 billion euros of Russian assets are frozen there, of which 180 billion belong to the central bank. And this phrase, honestly, I wouldn't have passed by this news. There are quite a few defenders of Russian gold in Europe. Of course, this is not for free, apparently. The most important thing for Euroclear is trust and reputation. We are the key link that must remain impeccable for the stability of financial markets, she emphasized. And she called the worst-case scenario the one in which, if the funds are transferred to Ukraine for reconstruction, Euroclear would be obligated to return them. And in this case, if the sanctions are lifted, Russia could come at any moment and demand these assets back, who will then return the 140 billion euros to us so that we can transfer them to Russia, who will return to thousands of Ukrainian families their loved ones, who will give Ukrainians back their cities that have been wiped off the face of the earth. Nothing changes, absolutely nothing. Yes, I understand they're afraid that now other dictators will rush to take their dirty money out of there. They'll move it to those jurisdictions where it will be safe, and then they'll suffer certain losses. Just as, at one time, people turned a blind eye to the origins of the Third Reich's gold in Europe, now they're protecting the assets of the modern-day Hitler. No, what are you talking about? What's the matter? What's the problem? Back then, people asked, what's the problem with supplying Nazi Germany with steel, fuel? I don't know. But we don't see who they're killing over there. Maybe they're not killing anyone at all. You can't touch Russian assets, it will damage the reputation. By the way, back in the day, the Nazis, just a note for Belgium, the Nazis, when they entered and occupied a country, the first thing they did was take the gold out of the banks. For example, from Belgium, they took 225 tons of Belgian gold, which was stored in France, and just blatantly sold it to Switzerland. And Switzerland at that time, we don't know whose gold this is. Of course we'll buy it. Switzerland didn't ask any questions. Just like they didn't ask any questions about gold that was melted down from jewelry, from the teeth of concentration camp prisoners. The main thing is reputation, not origin. Come on now. The main thing is stability, so that Hitler knew if he brought his gold here, we'd sell it in Portugal. Everything is stable, everything is fine. By the way, in the 1990s, documents were declassified that made it clear Swiss banks knew perfectly well where Nazi Germany's gold came from. Oh, please, of course they knew. Actually, by the way, there's an interesting book about this. It wasn't just Europe that traded with Hitler. It wasn't just Europe that cooperated with Hitler, and not even mainly Europe. I recently came across a book by an investigative journalist, published in 2001, by the investigative historian Edwin Black. It's called IBM and the Holocaust, a strategic alliance between Nazi Germany and America's most powerful corporation. I didn't know this fact, I admit. And in this book, there is documentary evidence showing how the IBM Corporation, which you all know, along with its German subsidiaries, cooperated with Adolf Hitler's Nazi government from the very creation of the Third Reich in January 1933 until the last day of the regime's existence in May 1945. That's already the end of World War II. The book publishes the role of IBM. They facilitated the creation and filling out of punch cards with data from the national census, military logistics, ghetto statistics, train movement management, concentration camp administration. It became much easier for the Nazis to identify Jews thanks to this card-based system. In general, after this war too, there will be books and investigations just like after the last war. Only I think there will be much more of them since we live in a digital world where everything leaves a trace. And let me remind you that next year, almost 40% of Russia's budget will go to defense and security forces. And what does that mean? It means that every dollar Russia receives strengthens its military machine. In other words, every dollar paid to Russia for what is bought from it is essentially a contribution to this war, to the killing of Ukrainians. I understand that until you find yourself grabbing your child in the middle of the night and running to a shelter, to the sound of air raid sirens until you've lost loved ones, until your home has been destroyed. It's just words from a distant country. Yeah, they're spending this much, spending that much. Even before this war, I remember how my great-grandmother would always say, if only there were no war or famine. I used to think, oh God, why do you keep saying that? The war ended a long time ago. Ukrainians now understand these words perfectly. The world has reached the point of flights to Mars, artificial intelligence, and unmanned vehicles. And in this world, one old balding scoundrel can allow himself to try to destroy an entire country and a free nation. I mean, what really infuriates Putin is that Ukraine refuses to surrender. It shouldn't be this way, friends. By the way, subscribe to this channel. It helps promote the channel and fight against Russian propaganda. But we are also shaking up that very mythical greatness of Russia and the paper rat who stands at the head of this Russia. So subscribe, let there be more of us, let more people know the truth. Well, in Russia, it so happened that it's the children who are rebelling. You see how things can turn out. In Moscow, school children and their parents are massively refusing to install the national messenger app Max. Only 7% of school children have installed this Max Messenger despite a very aggressive campaign by the authorities. These results were announced at a closed meeting of the Moscow Department of Education. That's 7% among children, 20% among parents, and 62% among teachers. Because teachers are the most vulnerable group. So if you thought that Putin would raise teachers' salaries and they would live well, no, they just have to survive. And humiliate themselves for every penny, take on extra work, cling to and worry about their jobs. Only then will they do everything they're told. They serve an important function for Putin. They have to indoctrinate children in schools. But the kids don't want it, you see. Only 7%. There's also, an interesting correlation there. The hardest place to implement this messenger is in institutions with a high level of academic achievement. That is, they compile an annual ranking there based on the results of the unified state exam. And the lowest adoption rates for this messenger were shown by the gymnasiums that win all the academic competitions. This messenger, it monitors Russians, it controls them, and so on. Why did they immediately call it Max? Why that name? They could have called it, I don't know, Big Brother or Big Pew or maybe Comrade Major. And yes, the dependence on the level of academic achievement also says a lot. Recently, the so-called SIM card cooling system started operating in Russia. I only found out about this recently myself. This is when a user enters Russia from another country, comes back from roaming into Russia, and their internet is blocked for 24 hours. Why was this done? So if a SIM card crosses the border, it could be inserted into a drone, so it needs to be disabled. That's why for all Russians who haven't verified their identity, in other words, if the authorities can't see that it's Ivan Ivanov, for example, the internet is turned off for 24 hours. Supposedly, this was done to combat drones that use these SIM cards. Well, let me put it this way. If at some point in Russia they introduce mandatory identity verification through this national messenger, or immediate disconnection from the internet and phone calls, everyone will be forced to install it. Maybe someone will get a second phone or find some other way. What used to seem like utopia in science fiction, in the works of Bradbury or Stanisław Lem, there are moments where, at a certain time of day, some kind of sound is supposed to play. In Russia, it would probably be a bell. And Russians would stand up and have to verify their identity, and they would have to do it through this messenger. And then they'd go about their business. So, as they say, remember this post. Believe me, in 6 months or a year, it won't seem like science fiction to you either. Well, now let's move on to overseas news. The US is preparing a bill on sanctions against countries that do business with Russia. So Trump confirmed that he knows preparations are underway, but I didn't quite understand. He's talking about the Graham and Blumenthal bill. But in the version they're preparing, he doesn't like it, because this bill implies introducing a 500% tariff on goods supplied to the US by those who buy Russian oil. A 500% tariff is basically an outright ban. Well, I think that's pretty clear. And the bill, as it is currently written, provides for the possibility of former President Donald Trump granting exemptions or authorizing delays in the interest of national security. So I don't know why Trump granted Orban a delay, what kind of national security is involved there. Orban really asked for it and got a 1-year delay, although Hungary itself is presenting it as if they were given an indefinite postponement. So if there are loopholes like this, then they'll grant a delay to China, saying, let's not quarrel, let's not impose these draconian tariffs on them. With India too, we somehow don't want to do it. Then we understand, well, what effect will there be? But we probably all understand very well that for Putin to really start squealing like a little rat, China and India would actually have to stop buying Russian oil. That's it. Putin is in a position of crippling dependence on China and India. Now, some Chinese and Indian companies are already replacing Russian oil, meaning the sanctions are starting to work. The noose around the Kremlin is tightening. But so far, only certain groups of goods from India have been hit with 50% tariffs, and even then, energy resources have not been affected by these sanctions. So Russian oil that goes to India's oil refineries is turned there into diesel, gasoline, and kerosene. And then these oil products are no longer subject to sanctions. And I really genuinely like the most recent and latest initiatives that have been coming from President Putin's government officials, who are now desperately trying to scrape together and collect whatever last remaining taxes they can possibly squeeze out of the population. This is all happening because, quite simply, there just isn't enough money left to fund the ongoing war effort. Why do I say that I like it, you might ask? Because it looks like agony. Raising taxes, taking. A new initiative. A proposal was made in the State Duma to raise the retirement age by 10 years. The author of the initiative, a deputy named Bessarab, claims that this way Russians will be able to increase their future pensions. Just imagine, if men retire at 75 and women at 70, then they'll be able to increase their pensions. So look, men at 75 years old, the average life expectancy for men in Russia is 68 years. So if people retire at 100, then you wouldn't have to pay anyone a pension at all. What a wonderful initiative. And still, if you meet Russian pensioners on the street, maybe not all of them, but if you ask them they want to raise the retirement age, well, what can you do? If it has to be done, then it has to be done. You see what I mean? This is exactly what I was talking about at the beginning of the program. When they adjust reality, well, if that's what the country needs, then so be it. But it's not for the country, it's for one bold muskrat who can't get out of the war, who no longer knows from which side to set Russia on fire, just to somehow win something in this war. There's also an interesting point about Trump and Maduro. Trump has finally announced his readiness to start negotiations with Maduro, after the aircraft carrier group had already entered the Caribbean Sea. So basically, Maduro, go hide in the cornfields, I guess I'll talk to you after all, said Trump. Well, he said they would like to talk, so we'll see what comes of it. And right away, another article comes out from Politico saying that Maduro might flee to Russia, following in the footsteps of Assad and Yanukovych. In fact, he has 4 possible escape options. It's Turkey, Cuba. Then there's Russia and somewhere else as well. So I really doubt it. The most likely option is Cuba, if he actually decides to flee. There are already billions made from that oil, I'll keep repeating it. Just imagine, Venezuela is the richest country in the world in terms of proven oil reserves, the richest, and look at what Maduro has done to it. I mean, by now there would already be, I don't know, some kind of shining city standing in the jungle. Everyone would be living in luxury. Well, maybe not everyone, but at least everyone would be living in comfort for sure. But no. As for Turkey, yes, Erdogan really can provide guarantees. Erdogan can give strong guarantees. But as for Cuba, Maduro, judging by the amount of money he has siphoned out of Cuba during his time in power, he could probably buy up half of Cuba for himself. And I'm pretty sure he sees Russia as a last resort, a place to run to because their dictators basically become prisoners there. They get stripped of everything. Their assets are taken under control. So Maduro will be walking around, and Patrushev will be standing guard in a watchtower, while Maduro, Assad, and Yanukovych stroll around the inner courtyard somewhere in the Moscow suburbs. So we'll see how things develop, but it looks like Trump is taking things seriously. Will they manage to squeeze Maduro out or not? I think they can. But we always judge dictators by rational standards, and that's something you can't do. There's even a term for it, the Maduro effect. That's when a dictator is willing to run the country into the ground, destroy the economy, start a civil war, set the whole country on fire just to hold on to power. This factor also needs to be taken into account. But there are other tools for that. They've already arrived in Puerto Rico. And as for you, friends, take care of yourselves, take care of your loved ones, subscribe to this channel, and let's help our artillerymen. the ones who are hitting the Russians so hard in the Pokrovsky direction that it's making their heads spin. Wishing us all a peaceful day and glory to Ukraine.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine Today. Join us now.